Before we begin our Q&A, and we look forward to addressing many of the important and timely questions you have collectively raised yesterday and today, we wanted to share a few observations and questions and amplify points raised over these 2 days and share some provocations for future practice. We will begin with the micro-level observations reflecting on insights from the 18 presentations comprising this symposium, then open up our reflections to a macro level view of implications and how this symposium provokes new practices.
Thank you. So I have the daunting task right now of really trying to distill out some of the implications that we have learned from the case studies that we've seen over the last 2 days. So let me begin by amplifying a thread that joins together nearly all of our presentations, which is that epidemics exploit and amplify social inequality. So we've seen how regulations of quarantine, self-isolation, social distancing, and many other interventions and the experience and impact of these. We see how we share these with many of the people who populated the case studies that we have seen so far. We have that in common. Yet we also reminded that these practices and experiences and even the incidence of disease itself were uneven across urban landscapes and communities due to nuances of racism and segregation. And even as Joshua mentioned, in the case of Prague, even just to the politics of neglect and indifference. So I think it's helpful for us to be reminded that othering and fear, unfortunately, accompany these pandemic responses. And this isn't just something that happens at a social level, but we can also see how this translates into mental maps of space or kind of collective understandings about spaces and urban zones. We saw really good examples of this by Desiree and Nicole and Fezanor thinking about prisoners of war and different regions of Mauritius and Galata, and how these different places and spaces and practices and peoples have been imbued with positive and or ultimately negative connotations in conceiving of the disease. So I think this is helpful in helping us echo and reflect on a question that was posed in yesterday's Q&A session, which is how we might better intervene with these ideas in mind, right? How do we really understand the other and how we can better take care of everyone and each other to cooperate, to put it in Joshua's terms, during these epidemics. So second, epidemics shape the location, instrument, and aims of local and national governments. This has been a really big insight that we explored not only today, but also we've seen certainly the role of local governments and today's case studies as well. Pandemics necessarily make major impacts on politics, and as we saw in Mehreen's presentation yesterday of Mughal India, it has forced governments to change or to move. Also, there's opportunities to perform one's own power or presence or efficacy or aims. And so really a lot of this is really imbued with symbolism as we think about the role that governments can play in rethinking the form and function of various urban interventions. I'm thinking here of the case of Naples from Sophia yesterday. So the symbolic is incredibly important here, but also pragmatics play a big role too. And especially at the local scale, this really is where meaningful interventions happen first. I'm thinking here of the examples of York from Anne-Marie and Cataline yesterday, thinking about Eastern Europe. We also have seen kind of echoes of how does this change come about, and one thing we wanted to amplify is that media is a tool to not only inform the public, but also to inform government's actions. And so this is something that we're going to be talking about a bit more, and in a moment, Mohammed's going to talk about this being a primary aim of convening this symposium, really thinking about how do we educate the public, and also how do we really work towards substantive change more broadly. Briefly stated, epidemics, as we can certainly see today, but also in these case studies, raise new challenges for occupational health, especially among the working class and frontlines workers. This is something that Emily raised in thinking about her case study in Bombay. Epidemics shape social practices, and of course, if we've seen many of these then in turn become social policies and built forms. So a nice example of this is thinking about social distancing. And as Irina showed us in London housing, this is kind of codified into built practices. How is housing reconsidered to codify some of these social practices? And of course, then these reforms echo long into the future and shape the way that we navigate and inhabit spaces. Also, we've seen how practices in life and also in death are shaped necessarily by these epidemics and pandemics. Stefan's case in Cairo was helpful in us in illustrating that we're not only thinking about what does social life look like among the living, but also among funerary practices, and how does that shape how bodies are conceived of and treated upon death. So there's some bigger observations here, which is the value of us looking at these multiple urban interventions and contexts and traditions as a way to have a robust wide-angle lens for us to view not only our current situation, but hopefully for us to think about what reforms make sense, what interventions make sense. I think the widest angle lens possible that we can use right now will be instructive to that end. We've seen that epidemics affect, and of course are affected by, regional and international commerce and trade. And really we've seen how these pandemics, these illnesses were transmitted along regional and international commerce and trade routes. So Kathleen's example yesterday was really helpful in mapping out the overlay of these two. But movement more broadly has been a theme that really has been echoed throughout these case studies. Movement not only just as a cause, but also as a response to the outbreak of epidemic illnesses, whether that's people fleeing to second homes or whether that's necessitated movement or enforced movement of bodies. Movement plays a key role here. And so we might be it might be instructive for us to think about these flows through space, not just thinking about the institutions or the interventions that are mapped onto our space, but in fact, how do people move throughout these both before, during, and after epidemic outbreak. Epidemics, as we have seen, affect built forms at many scales. So we've seen this from housing to hospitals, to zoning efforts, and everything in between. And of course, Nicole's presentation made me reflect on the fact that as we're thinking about urban environments, that really is the focus of our presentation today. We don't want to forget the impact of pandemics on natural environments. So both Desiree's and Nicole's cases today reminded us of the importance of thinking about our natural environment. And also more broadly, we might think about how climate change is going to make us increasingly vulnerable to these epidemic illnesses, and how might we be better prepared and think about this in our interventions. So a bigger observation here is that while we await, anticipate, and even advocate potential changes in cities and architectural design in this post-COVID or even current COVID era, our case studies remind us that the design and use of infrastructure, urban design practices, architecture is really only one part of this picture. In fact, we need to pay careful attention to the social life of these interventions as well, by which I mean their use, their experience, their meaning, their negotiation between and among people. Oftentimes resistance is part of this, as we saw in Susan's case study in Tokyo, and also Ruth's case study in Spain yesterday. And these are also sites of negotiation. Andrew's case in Bristol also reminded us of this fact too. So again, we don't want to just think about these as kind of static built forms, but really what is their use, what is their meaning, and how are they being used or even resisted in these different cases? And how does that help us understand the interventions that are currently being planned or built in our current COVID era? And finally, a related point is that epidemics necessitate and spur major planning projects. So we've seen many examples of how pandemics have led to these major design and planning projects from hospitals in Lisbon, and we've also seen cases in Naples and Bristol and Cairo. So these far-flung geographies have reminded us of the value of really thinking big in terms of these architectural and urban investments and projects. But this, of course, requires political will, which I know is increasingly challenging. We've talked a lot about the role of neoliberalism and also current austerity, and how does this challenge the need to really make these large investments. But these investments are great in the service of public health. They can be good, they can be benevolent, but I think as our case studies have shown us today, and I was really reminded of this in our presentations today, that often this will, to the kind of the will that accompanies these large projects can be good, but it can also be more ambivalent in really thinking about the greater symbolic or social or political aims that are met or that accompany these interventions into public health. Again, Sophia's example in Naples, I think Susan's examples in Tokyo, and Fariba's examples in Istanbul are helping us to see how also these interventions can be instruments of control and surveillance, punishment, or even appropriation. So we would be well advised to take a critical eye, not only to historical examples, but in particular to our present day context as well. On a much more positive note, I just wanted to end my observations or conclusions by thinking more positively about the productive power of these big, large-scale urban interventions. Carlo's presentation and exploration of Ingrassia in Italy reminded me that the goal really is not as productive if we're thinking about a new normal, right? That can perpetuate this state of emergency, but rather to think about how might we use this opportunity, these big projects that we might envision to design a better living condition for everyone. And I think that that's a beautiful takeaway here for us, is to really think big, to think about these major infrastructural changes that aren't only just in response to right now to disease mitigation, but maybe to help us think about and inhabit a much better life for everyone.
Thank you, Caitlin. These observations, based on the studies presented by speakers, lead to inspire and provoke more fundamental reflections on our role and shared responsibilities in the COVID and post-COVID age. So the case studies that we have discussed in the last 2 days confirm that despite our technological advances, human beings are not much different in dealing with COVID crisis versus pandemics in the medieval and early modern world. The principles are the same. The case studies prove how crucial it is to read history. They also confirm the marginalization of humanities, including history, in academia, and the real world has not helped the situation, as historians had already warned us about pandemics way before this crisis. So the goal is to make parallels between the past and present and to challenge our notion of history. History is not about the past, but also the present and future. And our responsibility is not necessarily to answer questions, but to raise new ones, define new frameworks, to encourage comparative studies on pandemics across geographies, have a forward-looking vision in the study of the built environment, and again, to stay relevant. Scholars of any kind, especially experts in humanities, architecture, anthropology, sociology, art, science, history, should be engaged in the discourse of pandemics. We should go beyond the boundaries of our fields and the academic world in general. This is a unique opportunity to broaden our audience, stay dynamic and proactive by publishing in newspapers and interviewing with media outlets, get engaged with our communities, and make an impact on the public. This is not the right time to stay passive. We are still living in the crisis, and our goal is not to present any solutions. Instead, we aim to highlight the nuances and complexities of the relationship between societies and pandemics, especially in the post-crisis era. The pandemics have presented us as scholars and practitioners a unique opportunity to collaborate across disciplines and continents, to go beyond our conventional platforms for knowledge sharing and dissemination, to be more innovative and affect decision-making processes in public health, architecture, design, urban planning, education, and even politics.